Hi, everyone. Welcome. We were running a little over in the room, so we're really happy and maybe, transition into a topic that actually builds off the last topic. So if there are some of you that were in the room for the last session, I think this is going to be a really nice amplification. So I think you might have gotten a vibe if you've seen Anita or I speak that we like to kick off with a little bit of infusion of humanity. So I'm going to ask you, Karan, to share what did you think you were going to be when you grew up? And then what are you doing now and what makes you just so passionate about it? And I can't wait for everyone to see how passionate you are about this.
Well, that's a great start. So growing up, I wanted to be an Air Force pilot. Yeah, and then
there's an industry that needs a lot of CX
aviation
support.
CX.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, I grew up in India, and then I moved around between the U.S., Canada. So joining the Air Force wasn't really part of the path, but aviation has been an area of interest. But what I do now is primarily focus on customer experience work. I've been in the CX space for about a decade now, and following the previous session, one of the primary ways I typically describe my work is I help organizations respond to change better. And I do that by working within CX. A lot of my background is to combine consumer psychology with experience design and work across the business in different industries and currently financial industry to drive more change and help drive more compelling impact for consumers.
That's great. So if you were in the previous session, you heard a little bit about the dynamic that occurs sometimes in our industry where someone becomes an accidental CX person. They were a hypo technologist or operations leader, product leader, and suddenly there's an opportunity, the strategy is changing. That was me. So I was the person at Prudential that was like, we should be customer-centric in financial services, and you seem to care a lot about the customer. So I was ordained a thing that I was materially unqualified to be. So the beauty of it was, I think I had enough self-awareness to go back and learn what I didn't know and learn some of the science that's complemented with the art, which is what I love about the topic that we're about to get into, which you have coined as the science of experience. So you are going to want more information on what you hear today, and I'm excited to share that you've published an article that is on LinkedIn around some of the data examples and an even deeper dive into what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to get right into it because one of the shifts that you've really promoted and from your thought leadership is the awareness that treating the development and management of experiences needs to really have the same rigor as product management and can lead to really tangible business impacts. So I'm hoping you can share a little bit around, how you've seen that come to life.
Yeah, in general, and again, this is a good segue from the previous conversation, when we look at data within any organizations, especially in context of CX, there's a lot of dialogue about where qualitative data comes in, where quantitative data comes in, and across different industries, there's a high level of maturity for product management. Product management is typically the rigorous model to deliver compelling products that are going to drive success. That could be digital products or physical products. And I currently work in the financial services space, so again, we have different types of product managers within the org. There's product marketing managers, there's product managers that are actually pricing and bundling the insurance and investment products, if you will, or if you're in healthcare, for instance, you could be product manager of a pharma drug. And then there's digital product managers. And generally what I've found is, especially in large matrix companies, all of those players are driving huge portfolios, but in a largely vertical fashion, in the sense that they could be working on a particular digital platform that is focused on consumers, or it could be an internal tool that is primarily used by our financial advisors or our internal employees. And typically, there are multiple product managers involved for all of those different tools, multiple product design teams, multiple research efforts, and if we zoom out, multiple funding rounds that are all doing similar yet disconnected work. So that's where experience management comes in the sense that rather than looking at building products in a more vertical fashion, how can we complement those vertical efforts across the business with a horizontal collaborative effort? And I think what Regina was also touching on earlier is that in a lot of environments, we have federated product partners, design partners, research partners who will jump right into that particular team or that particular project to support the work. But where I see CX as a more holistic function, if you will, is to continually evangelize for that horizontal collaboration as well, so that we can bring together product management in the same end-to-end journey, so to speak, that we look at a macro level with consumers. And for example, you mentioned one of the key things that we actively started to do at Northwestern Mutual is touch our claims experience. Of course, insurance industry, claims is top of mind for most of our clients and our financial advisors. And from the consumer's lens, claims is just a single experience in the sense that I am learning about what my product is, I need to file a claim, and I need to work with NM to do what they need and hopefully get the benefit. But that entire journey involves multiple in-house products, multiple consumer products such as our website or mobile app, multiple physical products like paper forms and whatnot, and how we connect different product managers, different cross-functional teams from marketing to sales to service across that one journey shifts or requires the shift from product management-driven thinking to journey management thinking or experience management thinking. And claims is a high activity project we've done for that, but at a more macro level, what we've started to do is define a language of experiences across the company to say, well, if we have 15 different products that our product management teams are driving toward, what are the complementing journeys that those products roll up to? What are the journeys for marketing? What are the journeys for customer service? And that goes back again to the continuous coaching and literacy around CX that I think Regina was also touching on earlier.
Yeah, I think this is again back to like the balance with art and science and the example that you used, because we also had we called it fulfillment, but the outcome related to a claim experience. And we had all the data in the world and the target from an expense management perspective to transform it. But until I played the calls where you could actually be immersed in how dreadful an experience it was to be scripted within an inch of your life in a death claim scenario, that qualitative dynamic pushed the outcome over the edge. And we had all the quantitative data in the world, and it just didn't make the difference in the boardroom. So yeah.
Can I add just a point on that? I know just in the previous session as well, Anita was saying, right, that qualitative data should be focused on more. I observed that too. One of the things I've found very helpful is to shift the narrative from qual and quant to experience data versus operational data, in the sense that typically, businesses, especially large companies, are used to tons and tons of operational data. Dashboards, left and right, a lot of commentary around handle times, revenues forecasts, internal usage metrics. But when we think experience data, it is a combination of qual and quant from the client's lens, but it forces the thinking beyond what our operational data is showing. And when we talk about it as X data and O data, if you will, operational and experience, it, again, surfaces up the need to have a more journey-centric mindset in terms of project planning. Because you're not necessarily funding individual products, you're funding individual journeys within the business.
And I happen to have an unfair advantage to see some work that you did around bringing this to life from a visualization perspective. If you don't mind, I'm going to go off script just for a second around, what has your experience been around taking the X and O data and visualizing it for leadership decisions and impact? Is there anything there that you think is meaningful to share with the group?
Yeah, so again, I made a quick comment about building a language model, so to speak, of journeys. Often, and I use the word journeys plural, right? Because often the organization outside of CX, let's say, has a perception that there's one end-to-end customer journey. And I like to share with people, as well as this crowd right now, that try and force out of that thinking and think about journey as multiple journeys across the company. The end-to-end journey, which is all about purchasing and then eventually sticking around or buying and promoting more, that is more of a marketing funnel, where you are starting with awareness, getting into conversion, and going downstream. And there's a lot of familiarity around that. But when we start to define what are all the individual experiences within awareness, or what are all the individual journeys within customer service, we can then start to invite dialogue about what kind of operational data do we know about these? If there are 14 different individual journeys within customer service, what do we know about them? What are the handle times for it? What's the cost to serve for it? And then layer in the customer data on it to say, well, we know what the handle times are, or to some degree we know what volumes are, but do we know what the priority journeys are for the customer? And that layering, which is where some of the visualization Lauren's mentioning came in, it allows us, and it allowed us at NM, to create a heat map, if you will. It's a very rudimentary heat map on a visual scale that looks like a grid to say we have X number of journeys that really touch customer service, we have Y number of journeys that really touch marketing, and product management touches all of them, which means CX touches all of them. And that, again, invites more discussion about data gaps, which of course we all have, right? But also it invites conversation about how we organize teams. Rather than focus on individual products, again, focus on journeys.
Yes. So at the end of the day, it all roads lead back to people, whether they're our customers or whether they're our colleagues. And so a lot of your perspective is around the cross-functional nature of the science of experience. And who are those stakeholders? And we talked in the last previous session, there was a parallel drawn to wanting to be a lawyer early on and now having to have that same advocacy and influence. So how do you work, optimally cross-functionally? Have you experienced being the most influential in that way? And how do you get to adoption in the science from the areas that are less familiar with it?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah.
The way I like to think about cross-functional partnerships is almost in categories. Most of us in general have done some sort of ecosystem mapping, stakeholder mapping with our work. I actually think of it in context of what we're enabling. I think CX in general is an enabling function in business. We're not an operating function. We don't necessarily drive and own all the P&L of, say, marketing, or we don't necessarily drive and own the P&L of service, especially when we look at CX as a more holistic practice instead of a subset of marketing. What we are doing, and what my experience has been, is that we are actively being a tailwind behind these operating functions like product management, like sales, like service. And if we start to think about our role as an enabler like that, the partnerships start to look a little different, because on individual projects, instead of thinking in agile sense, such as, well, we have a product designer, we have product owner, we have engineers, we start to think in terms of agility as a CX team, to say, well, we have product and design and research, but then we also have legal, we also have someone from marketing, we also have someone from sales, lending their voice in terms of this cross-functional project. And as Anita, I think, shared in the previous session, right? Sometimes it's a quick win project we're working on. So when we start projects, I've found that by positioning ourselves as an enabling function, or our role within CX, we're able to invite dialogue from all these different parties to say, well, who are the relevant stakeholders from our operating functions, like service, marketing, and whatnot? Who are the relevant stakeholders from our control functions, like finance, compliance, privacy? And then who are our peer functions, such as product design, product management? And that type of cross-functional dialogue tends to be pretty new in my experience, because when most companies think agile, they think product development, that we do a lot of agile delivery, we ship things very quickly. Well, that's great, but how are we being agile in terms of customer impact? That's where this kind of evolved model comes in.
Have you seen a different degree of friction between those stakeholders by industry at all, or is there any patterning that you would say in this scenario there seems to be more input or higher weight of power shift in this area versus another?
So strong, yes, in terms of nuances between industry. I mentioned a couple of points about product management. Product management in the software industry works a little bit different, I think, than non-software industries. I've spent a lot of time working within the software industry, and now I'm in financial services. But within product management, again, I mentioned there's digital product management, and then there's, let's call it non-digital product management, such as product marketing and whatnot. So when we bring all these teams together in such a cross-functional sense, there's a lot of expectation setting around the shared ownership, if you will, in the sense that product management, of course, has the ownership for a lot of our tactical solutions and the general vision around the product strategy. Marketing, of course, has a lot of accountability around the overall compelling narrative and the brand tone and whatnot. But CX doesn't have specific accountability. We have a lot of responsibility to share in those outcomes. So that conversation around expectations can become a challenge in the beginning of projects. But I like to typically have those discussions earlier on so that downstream we don't get into confusing dialogue around who's driving what or who's moving which things forward.
Yeah, interesting. I was in the financial services industry for so many years, but I think what we would do, which I always think is an opportunity to just take a step back and sort of flip the script on what you would be doing externally, we would typically in the teams that I was leading when we were doing a launch of a new initiative or a new project, we would do the persona mapping for the internal stakeholders the same way we would do persona mapping for the customers. And then we would have individuals on the team each sort of take a partner that they were going to work hard to help understand what the mission was, help influence the relationship. And so I think it's funny because sometimes you almost don't even use your own tools that you would use in a commercial sense internally to drive the same type of influence and outcome. So yeah, thank you for sharing. I think that's really important. Everyone needs buy-in and money to get this work done. So just sort of moving towards the balance between creativity and impact. How can you, bring the right level of creativity with the right level of certainty and become a force multiplier in terms of this ecosystem?
That's another big topic. I touched on that a little bit in the article Lauren mentioned earlier, and Regina mentioned design. And the practice that I drive within my work is called design strategy. It's basically part of our client experience office within the product and design functions. But when we look at design in that context, it is rooted in the creative problem-solving process, if you will, which a lot of us have been exposed to as part of the CX space. But it is about balancing the emergence of new ideas and that unconstrained thinking, if you will, within the commercial reality of not only the specific industry we're in, but the specific journey we're working in. I gave the example of claims earlier. That's one of our most compelling consumer experiences. But at the same time, it is also one of the most focused experiences where we need to balance how efficient and quick we're being to help our clients and to help their caregivers or their beneficiaries. So that efficiency gets looked at in context of our operational data, in context of our overall human capital within the company, how ready are our teams for it. And typically when we think of creative work, we think of imagining aspirational, out of the possible experiences from the anchoring of design thinking. And there's a lot of value in it. But the flip side, where efficiency comes in, it often it's an ambiguous space for the creative work. So what we try to do is, in these cross-functional core teams, let's call it, we try and continuously balance the emergence of new ideas with the commercial reality of the individual journey. And that means, earlier in the project, when we start off with persona mapping or research, almost at the same time, we start looking at what kind of raw metrics do we have. Not specific to NPS and CSAT, which are high-level, very valuable beacon metrics, but what is the specific telemetry for the digital products, for the broader customer experience for that journey, which could include cost to serve, which could include expense ratios, or many other specific feature, specific metrics. So that balance paints a picture which, again, goes back to qual and quant, but it also gives a sense of assurance to a lot of our business partners across the company, partners within the operating functions that I was mentioning, to understand that CX isn't parachuting in with out of the possible ideas and parachuting out. Rather, CX is being a tailwind or a force multiplier for our efforts to balance out of the possible with the realities of what we can execute within the near and the short and the long term.
Yeah, so I want to make sure that I get to this question before we open it up for questions because it's near and dear to my heart. I felt like I was in a dynamic for a while where it was a little bit Groundhog Day. There was a lot of friction between the desire to have 5-year roadmaps for transformation and then falling out of love with that every 2 years and having to, reinvent something that in particularly a long existing company with a lot of tenured and legacy technology is kind of difficult to overcome? And how do you also ensure, as you fall in and out of love, that you're not creating the tech debt of the future? So I'm just curious if you have any more examples or stories, maybe even things to avoid, in this space around how do you ensure that when you have to articulate the right balance of efficiency with the art of the possible and what could be seen in certain scenarios at times when there's a lot of constraints as nice to haves, not imperatives to have. Do you have any thing that you can share as examples in your experience around how do you articulate or juggle that balance?
Yeah, several examples come to mind, but you did mention we want to have Q&A as well. But one of the recent things we're exploring, it's in flight, continuous improvement, is this idea of how people think about changes to insurance products, how people think about maybe renewing their life insurance policies or extending them, switching products. And often that experience is similar to me calling Verizon or, TELUS or Rogers and changing my phone plan or asking about what can I change if I'm off contract or whatnot. In context of financial services, however, largely this space operates via a B2B model. We don't directly sell to the consumer. We have our sales distribution workforce, financial advisors, that drive that dialogue with consumers. And that means our digital transformation efforts are very much tailored toward empowering our financial advisors so that they can better support and equip our clients with the right tooling. So the experience around making any kind of changes to insurance policies is a mix between digital products and engagement, where consumers can maybe look at something online, and calling our advisors. And often the conversation, and earlier this year, started to shift into the idea that large company, old antiquated systems as well, are there certain systems that we need to really modernize? Of course, the short answer is always yes at huge companies, but how can we be more tactical about it? How can we be more focused about it? So that conversation led to a lot of exploration around what the consumer expectations are. Do they really look at it as, I want to open the NM app and change something? Or do they really look for feedback from their advisor? And we can shield them from relatively old user experiences, let's say. And in exploring those discussions, we found that it's not necessary for only compelling experiences to be front and center. We can still have a compelling experience by having a strong human connection from our advisors, if you will, as opposed to the fastest, most easiest, most intuitive digital experience. And that was a little surprise because it's not very intuitive for us to think that we're going to intentionally shield our consumers from some of the digital friction because they prefer to go talk to an advisor when they want to make a change like that. And we wouldn't have uncovered all of that if we had started to only look at what it is that the client is looking for. We were looking more in context of what it is that the client is looking for, what it is that our current maturity is, and what is our financial advisor's current capability. And that mix of data allowed us to also balance, those trade-offs, if you will.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had a similar experience where we had quite a hefty expense target to meet with the intention of retaining all of our customer experience and NPS simultaneously, which, I feel like you can only really do with the right application of technology, but a ton of pushback in the intermediary space where there wasn't an appetite to actually, engage in that way. And ultimately, the offer to white label what we were doing in a B2C perspective to the intermediaries solved that problem. But you did have to get creative around how can we get excitement around working in a different way. And when it became, well, it's not going to be us putting this on you, this is actually going to integrate into the way that you're already engaging with your customers, then, we had some traction. So you got to find back to the what's in it for me outcome of the win. So.
And it just further instills the idea, right, that the digital transformation agenda isn't entirely about digital. It's really about cohesion and relevance for the consumer. And that means digital in many cases, but it also means other channels in a lot of other cases.
That's such a great cohesion. I love that word. So I want to make sure that again, I've said this in a few of the sessions, as good CX professionals, we care a lot about the fact that the users are getting out of the session what they were hoping to get out or hear. So what questions might you have for us? Thank you. There's a mic coming, but I'm sure we could probably hear you, but yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I've been trying to help financial institutions change digitally and operationally, and we find it difficult to convince a traditional financial institution to understand and to see when change is successful. What 3-4 simple metrics would you use to convince them that the change that you have led is successful?
Oh, 3-4 metrics, metrics galore. There are so many options. When I think about telemetry around anything related to customer experience, I'm of the opinion that NPS and CSAT are helpful at a beacon level, but they don't convey change. In my experience, they have never revealed the why behind our demonstration of progress. And when we rely only on those, which I alluded to earlier, it misses certain opportunities. So when we look at metrics in specific contexts, or in context of your question as well, rather than look at it as, well, these are the top 3 or 4 metrics that we look at end-to-end, in recent times, especially at NM, and over the course of my career too, I found that when we're more granular, specific to individual journeys when it comes to metrics, we're able to demonstrate a lot more impact. And that means for an experience such as I'm filing a claim and receiving the benefit, that experience could have metrics that touch our handle times, that touch our customer effort score if they're engaging online, or metrics that focus more in terms of just general expense ratios, right, that are part of any company's operational health, because it touches both sides of the spectrum, not just customer impact. For other journeys, such as I am learning about insurance products, or I'm learning about investments, we could look at telemetry in context of whether they started online. Did they convert online? Did they fill something out online as a call to action to meet with an advisor? And those metrics could look a little bit different. So with every individual journey, at the beginning of the project, if you will, we try and baseline what are those core metrics, if you will, that we can baseline, that we can demonstrate progress toward, rather than look at it only as end-to-end to say, well, these are the 4 metrics of CX that we're driving, because NPS and CSAT already are within that space. The why behind the NPS and CSAT element is somewhat cloudy because CX is an enabling function. So our impact to NPS is almost always by correlation instead of by causation. Product may be driving A, B, and C efforts, legal may be enabling those efforts, and finance may be enabling those efforts, and customer service might also be enabling it, and the customer receives a compelling experience. And all of those changes together are driving or demonstrating higher NPS, let's say, as opposed to CX pulling one lever and CSAT is improving. So that logic is where some of the specific journey-specific metrics have come in really handy in terms of demonstrating impact. And also, it just introduces more agility in dialogue, because that way we are building more bottom-up buy-in within the business to say that these aren't CX-specific metrics, these are your metrics within customer service or your metrics within sales. And we're your business partner to boost them, whatever your specific metrics may be. And on top of that, if we can add in more customer-specific data, like the effort score as an example.
Yeah. My experience was a little different, actually. In getting buy-in, typically in a 150-year-old financial services institution, I had to bring in not metrics, but humanity. I had to introduce people to literal customers that I wasn't allowed to actually bring in because compliance and risk wouldn't let us actually speak to customers. So I brought in my parents because they owned 3 different lines of products with Prudential, and they didn't know they were my parents, and they had a conversation around why they get so much paper, why do they have to call for their minimum required distribution every year, and guilt and competition and really having to face somebody's parents changed a lot. So sometimes it's storytelling and immersion and having to kind of face the music. So different, not a metric, different approach.
Just as effective.
Yeah.
Hi. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for the speech. It was great. made lots of notes here. I also work in the insurance industry, and I have a question because we are going through a digital transformation. We do deal with some customers that we're trying to transition from that paper manual process into a digital path. And I was just curious if you have any recommendations for that demographic we're dealing with to have them go digital and eliminate all the paper.
Yeah, it's a popular question in recent times for me, I think, because even internally we keep talking about it. We've as well been on a trajectory of going paperless. Whenever the idea of paperless processing, paperless experiences comes in, one of the things that I try and hold myself accountable for, as well as our team, and just in terms of our work across the CX practice at NM, is let's not just lift and shift. A crappy paper process being digital is still a crappy digital process. So when we think about that specific demographic that is very intentional about preferring things to be digital, and if you're on that journey to shift the thinking, shift a lot of product development around it, try and think about what is the surface to core process, not just the end-to-end journey, the business process that is requiring you to even have a form in the first place. So that rather than you digitizing a form and then capturing data online instead of pen and paper, question whether you need to capture that data. And if you need to capture that data, can you grab it from somewhere else instead of, directly from the consumer? So those kinds of provocative questions, I'll say, will spark a lot of dialogue, again, cross-functionally. Very likely, especially if you're in insurance, with legal and compliance, to say, does this make sense? Or should we, look at it in a completely different manner? And doing it that way, one, it's going to be very compelling for the consumer because it's less effort. And two, it might even introduce more efficiency for the business because it's less operational overhead.
Yeah, please connect with us offline too. I have lots of lessons learned I'd be happy to share, even around signature analysis on why you need a wet signature. And no one that works in the company is a handwriting analyst or specialist, so I'm not sure what a wet signature is actually going to do. But so lots of war stories. I know we're a little bit over. Is there anything final from the group? I can't stress enough how much I would encourage you to be redirected to the newsletter that Karan had printed, or I guess published would be the right word, last week. There's a lot of detail and a lot of other really great examples in there. So thank you for your time. Thanks for attending our session, and amazing.
Thank you.